A lot has happened during the past year and a half at WNL, in the nation, and of course across the globe. During times of upheaval and stress, the values that feel most important to us can become clearer, or they can change. The Mudd Center's program this year will focus our attention on daily ethics. That's how, or if, our personal values are actually manifested in the actions and decisions of our daily lives. Since our habits cumulatively shape our lives and the world around us, we'll think together about the impact of our daily ethics as well. The Daily Ethics Lecture Series will include 10 distinguished speakers from different disciplinary and professional backgrounds. They'll address big questions like defining a meaningful life and making a difference, using information and constructing knowledge in our lives, navigating the responsibilities of being a citizen in our communities, of a nation, the world, and the earth. I think the WNL community will be inspired by how our speakers' personal values have been manifested in their professional choices and activities as well. The Daily Ethics Mosaic Project is an especially exciting part of our program this year. The Mudd Center is partnering with the Stanier Gallery and with the artist Jonathan Lee to offer a series of workshops this fall that will culminate in the production of a large-scale community artwork. After so much isolation, the prospect of working on a community project together feels great. The Mosaic workshops will involve individual art making as well as collaborative art making. So students, staff, and faculty will have a chance to think deeply about their own values and choices, and also discuss and create a collective product. I can't wait. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so delighted to see all of you here for the last lecture in the Mudd Center for Ethics Daily Ethics series. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Mark Coddington, one of our own. I want to talk a little bit about the Daily Ethics series more broadly, just to set the stage for Professor Coddington's talk today. So the Daily Ethics series has focused on the meaning of our everyday choices and habits. After all, how do we express our most important personal values, if not through our behavior every day? How do we shape the world, if not through our behavior every day? We live out our values through holding ourselves accountable for choosing what to eat and what to purchase, through actively upholding democratic ideals, and through interacting with the environment in ways that minimize harm. Even in situations in which, realistically, our individual behaviors will have a negligible impact. In Andrew Schignell's framework, he called this, even if we aren't eating the threshold chicken. We show what values are important to us by talking about them, by behaving in ways that are symbolically important, and by setting an example for other people. One of the newest and perhaps most defining aspects of our daily lives is digital media consumption. Our smartphones are our constant companions, our new appendages. So no consideration of daily ethics would be complete without discussing this new way of being. So today we'll hear from Mark Coddington, Associate Professor of Journalism and Mass Communication at WNL, who's an expert in the sociology of digital journalism. Prior to pursuing an academic journalism path, Professor Coddington was a reporter for the Grand Island Independent, covering a 16-county region of central Nebraska. For this work, he was awarded 7 Nebraska Press Association awards, among other honors. Professor Coddington joined the WNL faculty in 2015 after earning a PhD in journalism from the University of Texas in Austin. In our curriculum, he teaches reporting, news writing, social media, data storytelling, and digital journalism. He co-founded and co-authors the RQ1 email newsletter, which is a monthly resource that summarizes and explains the latest academic research on news and journalism. His 2019 book is called Aggregating the News: Secondhand Knowledge and the Erosion of Journalistic Authority. Today, Professor Coddington will orient us to the journalistic ecosystem that he studies, as well as its implications for our society. His lecture is entitled The Everyday Ethics of Scrolling Through Social Media: How to Avoid Getting Buried in an Online Information Avalanche. So with that, please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
All set? We're okay? All right. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Carla, and it's such a pleasure to speak to all of you tonight. I know, as Carla and I were saying ahead of time, this is such a crazy time in the semester, and I know how difficult it is to carve out an hour and 15 minutes at 5 o'clock on a Thursday in week 10 of a WNL semester, so I'm very grateful. And it's such a pleasure to be able to talk with you. As I was preparing for this talk, I was trying to think if there was anything in contemporary society that we were so deeply drawn to and yet hate so much as social media at the same time. I was trying to think, like reality TV, or the Kardashian family, maybe pumpkin spice, just the flavor. And I couldn't really come up with anything. Like, none of those things really holds the draw for social media. And the draw for social media really is quite obvious. You know, like all of us, I could have you all go into your screen time and we could kind of have true confessions about how much time we spend on social media. But we all know that the draw is there. But the hatred is really kind of present in the way that we talk about social media. We talk about social media as if it is the bane of our existence. All of us talk about sort of the damage that it's doing to society and to our lives and our relationships, and all of us want to use it less. And that kind of hatred of social media comes out, and simultaneous tension with that draw with social media comes out in some very interesting ways. I saw a survey earlier this month from Gallup and the Knight Foundation that found that 76% of respondents, which is American respondents, said that they did not trust the information that they got on social media. And yet, in the same survey, the same people, when they asked about the main reasons that they go onto social media, 62% said they go to social media to stay current with the news. So try to put those two things together. And I think that really is indicative of how we feel about it. And I think this sort of hatred, this disgust and dissatisfaction with social media, it really kind of points to something that is illustrative, which is this sense that this thing that we do kind of love so much and are so deeply drawn to is not doing the things for us that we hoped that it would. And yet, when we think about the discourse that we use with social media, I think a lot of it is really pointed in some kind of unproductive directions, even as it's critical of social media. We often kind of talk about social media as if it is kind of an independent actor, something out there kind of doing things to us. You know, we talk about social media as sort of destroying relationships, or it's polarizing society, or it is, you know, kind of ruining journalism, or things like that. And I really tonight, my goal is to help us kind of flip that lens around, because I think that the question that we most often ask with social media is, what is social media doing to us? But I think a much more fruitful question, especially if we're thinking through the lens of everyday ethics, is what are we doing with social media? What sort of purposes is social media serving for us? Are those purposes good and right and just and true? And if those are the purposes that we're using social media for, is the way we're using social media actually helping us accomplish these purposes like it should? So what I want to do is kind of go through first thinking about the backdrop of social media, just kind of the state of play, like where we're at in social media's role in society. And then I want to kind of flip that lens around and start to kind of think through in a couple of different ways that the way that we're using social media is not actually the best for kind of our ethical obligations and kind of the purposes for which we want to use it. And then I'll close with a few suggestions for ways we can kind of reshape, just practical everyday ways that we can kind of reshape our relationship with social media. So I want to start by giving kind of the backdrop here. And when I talk about the backdrop, I think it's important to note here that this is not the thing that I am trying to persuade you of. This is just kind of the state of play, the state of affairs for social media. And I think one of the best ways to start thinking about the backdrop culturally and socially for social media is what is social media optimized for? If we think about what is the main purpose that social media is sort of built to do best. And it's not inevitable that social media was optimized for the thing that it is optimized for. We could have had a social media that was optimized for community, that was really made for deep and rich and meaningful community. We could have had a social media that was optimized for truth, that was optimized for depth and quality and real accuracy of information. We could have also had a social media that was optimized for wisdom, for real depth and complexity and nuance of analysis. But clearly, we did not get a social media that was optimized for those things. I would submit that social media, pretty much across platforms, is fundamentally optimized for one thing, and that is engagement. So when I say engagement, I mean all the things that we think of when we think of the design of social media, like the algorithm and the way the algorithms function. When I'm thinking of push notifications, app designs, all those things, they're all funneled towards one basic purpose, and that is to keep us in the app as long as possible. And then to keep us coming back to the app as long as possible, and then to expand the number of people who are continuing to come back to the app. Now, why is that the case? Well, all of these social media platforms, they're all for-profit companies. They're all built to make money. And what type of companies are they? We kind of think about social media companies as being sort of tech companies or media companies, because they're in Silicon Valley and media is in the name. But I don't think they're probably best thought of that way, because if we think about how they make their money, really fundamentally they are data companies. That's really what they are. Because you think about how they make their money through advertising, overwhelmingly. And what is the thing that social media companies have to offer advertisers? They have the ability to capitalize on just absolute reams of data, unprecedented amounts of data on all of us that allows advertisers to target us and to kind of segment us into very, kind of niche and very profitable sort of ways. That is the pitch that they have for advertisers. So in order to make that work, they need to continue collecting data from us, because all of that data comes from our actual actions in the apps. It comes from our swipes, it comes from our shares, from our viewing, our watch time, our comments, all of these, our likes, all of these sorts of things. This is where their data kind of comes from. So as they're producing it, that is fundamentally what they're doing. So if we think about it, fundamentally, at bottom, social media companies are data collection machines. That is what they do. So as they keep us in the app, their goal to keep us in the app, A, they get to serve us more ads, but B, they also get to continue to collect data from us. So all the things that we tend to think about social media as being for us and doing for us, on one level, they are just the things that those platforms give us to make us happy enough to continue to hand over our data. Now, this is a process that many scholars have called surveillance capitalism. This idea that fundamentally we are sort of becoming willing participants in our own surveillance, in our own kind of watching and sort of handing over to data to these companies so that they can make money off of our data. Now, this may feel completely like 101 sort of review. You may have heard this before. This may be a new way of looking at social media. And it may sound very conspiratorial and dark, but I swear to you, I am not being conspiratorial or cynical here. This is just literally the way the industry works. This is as if I was describing to you like how grocery stores make money or like how a door factory works. This is just how the social media industry works. So we have that surveillance capitalism component of like the state of play for social media. The second area is we think about misinformation. We know that misinformation is rampant on social media, and we've seen that through misinformation about COVID, about vaccines, misinformation about the 2020 election and its aftermath. We've seen it through more kind of harebrained conspiracy theories like QAnon and Pizzagate and things like that. And we see it in much more everyday ways, like the memes that your friends' parents share with quotes from people who there is no way on earth they actually said the quotes that are attributed to them. Now, we actually tend to overestimate the amount of misinformation that is found on social media, but even the true information on social media, of which there is much, is often presented in little bite-sized nuggets, completely devoid of context. And we are scrolling through it so quickly at a pace that we couldn't possibly be able to comprehend it. And often just functions solely as grist for kind of the partisan argumentative mill. The point is basically ammunition in our constant war sort of with each other. Now, on top of that, we also have to grapple with the fact that social media is a deeply unpleasant place for a lot of people. And that's especially the case for women and for people of color. But all of us have seen the kind of shrillness of discourse, the extremism, the erosion of civility in favor of just abuse and harassment running rampant on social media. So all of these things are factors, but I think it's important here not to kind of careen overboard in our assessment of social media, because it's not actually often as bad as we make it out to be. And I think about a lot of times in our discourse about social media, especially, I think about it in reference to the popular Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. How many of you seen The Social Dilemma, by the way? Okay, so this is like reasonably familiar. I think in discourse with a lot of things like that, there's a tendency to kind of pin social media as sort of the root of all kinds of evil, that there is like no social ill that social media cannot be blamed for. Like, it topples governments. It destroys an entire generation of teenagers. It's destroying democracy in our country, et cetera. And I think a lot of times these narratives can kind of take on sort of this runaway train aspect where they really get sort of unmoored from kind of reality and fact. You take, for example, the notion of echo chambers in social media. The idea that like social media kind of fosters these sort of political cocoons where we just get surrounded, the algorithm just feeds us more and more ideas that agree with the things that we've always thought, and this gets us thinking that everybody thinks this way, and we just kind of like can head off and get more and more entrenched and extreme in those ideas. That's a pretty common kind of idea about social media. It's pretty much reached the point of a truism at this point. But at this point, we've also done a lot of social science research on the echo chamber idea, and we're starting to reach something of a consensus, and we're actually finding that while we certainly love to get information that feeds our pre-existing biases, which we'll talk more about later, that problem is actually not demonstrably worse on social media than it is in other areas of life. In fact, in some ways, it might even be mitigated in some social media environments. Or, for example, the notion that social media is causing polarization. It is pushing us further and further apart. And decades of political science and social science research have found that polarization far preceded social media, and that the best way to kind of evaluate social media's role in polarization is as a secondary cause at best. But all of these kind of misconceptions about social media, I think, stem from this idea that social media is this kind of external, independent actor out there doing things to us. So that's kind of the state of affairs when viewed from that perspective. And now I really want to kind of turn the lens around and think in kind of a deep and sustained way about what are we doing with social media, and is it the things that we want to be doing with social media? If you think about the way that we talk about social media, we talk about the algorithm, like we've made the algorithm into a person, you know? And we talk about the algorithm actually as this like villain that is trying to like, you know, foist all these things on us. And we often use, when we talk about our phones, we often use the language of addiction when we talk about our phones. I mean, how many of you have heard or even said things like, I'm addicted to, you know, such and such social media app, or dealing with such and such of an addiction? And I think that kind of language is quite convenient for us, but not actually accurate, because it's convenient in that it really externalizes the problem. It allows us to avoid thinking that any of the problems in the ways that the roles that social media is playing in our society might actually be sort of our issues. And instead, the problem is these devices. It's over here. If we can just kind of fix and change these devices and these algorithms, then the problem kind of goes away. And I often tell my students that I don't think the language of addiction is the best way to think about our phones or social media, even if we're spending hours and hours on it a day. Because I think fundamentally, we're not addicted to our phones. We're not addicted to social media. We are addicted to the feelings that social media gives us. We are addicted to the desires that social media gratifies. Now, that is not really meant to absolve Silicon Valley from their complicity in these sort of problems. Remember, I just laid out this, you know, very dark kind of surveillance capital sort of scenario. And if I were giving this talk in Silicon Valley, it would be very different. But I'm not talking to Silicon Valley. This is part of a lecture called Everyday Ethics, and I'm talking to everyday sort of media users. And I think the first way that we have to start to kind of rethink our relationship to social media is by actually kind of evaluating what is it about social media that draws us in so much, and what is it about us that is so drawn to social media. And that requires some pretty deep and introspective kind of heart work for us. Is it for us, and oftentimes we might not like the answers that we get. Are we so deeply compelled to use social media and drawn to it because of this gnawing need for affirmation and for validation in order to feel kind of whole and feel like ourselves? Or is it, and this is one especially for me, a need to constantly have all of the world's information kind of coming at us and at our fingertips so I can feel control over my surroundings. And I can feel like I am in control of what's going on because I have access to all of this information? Or is it the need to constantly feel connected for you, but without any of the messiness that comes with actual kind of embodied human relationships with flawed people? These sort of constant feeling of connectedness, but at a distance. Or it might be something that we're afraid of, you know? Is it because we're afraid of boredom, or afraid of silence, or afraid of being alone, or afraid of pain, of feeling something like that? So again, I think all of these things are things that we have to consider as we're doing it. And ultimately, the problem is fundamentally, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with the devices and the way they're described, but the problem is ultimately not the devices. The problem is in here. And that's where we have to kind of start when we turn this lens around. So what does this look like practically? I want to give two kind of concepts of examples to think about this. One smaller and then one I'll spend a little bit more time on. First, I think about the concept of telos. This is from Greek philosophy, and I am not a philosopher, but I at least understand enough to know it's an Aristotelian sort of concept. And telos is this idea of like an ultimate kind of goal, a supreme goal or end, a kind of what is this thing sort of made for, and when have we kind of accomplished it? And a lot of people have applied it over the years to actions or to tools. And I really like the writer, Alan Noble, has argued that the dominant use of social media in today's society has no actual telos. And he describes it as expressive individualism. This notion that to be an individual in today's society fundamentally is to assert ourselves. And the way we assert ourselves and say, here I am, world, is by expressing ourselves. And we express our opinions, our beliefs, our thoughts, the things we like, the things we don't like, and this is what it means to be a human in society. And he argues, and I'm inclined to agree with him, that fundamentally this mode of social media use has no telos. It has no end. And you can see this in the way that people actually who use social media this way, the way that they use it. I have never, maybe you have, but I doubt you have probably ever seen anybody whose mode of social media use is this form of expressive individualism basically say, I have achieved my purpose, I have finished expressing myself, success, I am done. I'm off of these platforms forever. No, the reason these people leave is because they stepped in it, and they have to leave for that reason. The reason why nobody achieves this sort of mode of success is because there is no end. It's never designed to end. It's designed to continually just feed on itself. The only end is more expression, more need to assert ourselves in the world. And this feeling, again, this notion did not start with social media. This is a much deeper kind of socially and culturally developed desire. But you can bet our social media companies are very happy to exploit this in order to keep us in the app more and more and more and more so that there's no ever actual end. So that's an example of what it might look in one way. Another way that I think, again, is a little bit kind of deeper and I think ultimately, much more influential. A lot of us think about, we talk about how social media allows us to present a really curated sense of ourselves, a very carefully edited sense of ourselves that we put together, the best parts of ourselves. And that when you go on Instagram, you are just seeing everybody's best sort of presented selves. And a lot of when I talk to my students, we kind of understand that this is something that goes on with social media. But again, this is not something that social media is doing to us. This is something that we are doing to ourselves. And what I would contend that we are doing is trying to gain control and find an identity in a world that has left us adrift. I think about the Presbyterian minister and theologian Timothy Keller has said that social media has become the place for us to get control over the presentation of ourselves. You don't have to daily live face-to-face with people. To get feedback about that presentation with unprecedented scale and speed, and then to constantly calibrate and curate our identities in order to get affirmation from our chosen community. And I think that's a pretty good kind of overall description of sort of what's going on with that curated self on social media. And we'll put a pin in that because we're going to talk about that in a second. There's another Presbyterian minister and theologian, Derek Rishmawi, who describes this in actually more detail, and the process by which this process of sort of putting forward this sort of curated version of self, responding to feedback, and then deciding which parts of self to curate, put forward and hold back. But he talks about the process by which this goes a step further, which actually forms our identity to the point where we actually think we are that person. And he talks about it as tweeting ourselves into an identity. And he describes that we put a portion of ourselves on whatever our social media platform is of choice, and then see how many retweets that gets, how many likes, how many shares. And then we start to kind of decide, okay, let's put forward the most retweeted, most shared, most liked version of ourselves. And the extra step that he talks about is the point at which, once we start to do that, we start to convince ourselves that the reason that part of ourselves is the most retweeted, liked, shared part of ourselves is because that is who we truly are. That is why people like and share and retweet this ourselves, is because this is who I really am. And so what you get with that process is that we end up sort of becoming and identifying with who we have sort of presented, this carefully edited self that we have presented ourselves to be on social media. Now, again, none of this started with social media. This process of putting forward, carefully presenting a self, then responding to feedback, and then representing self, the sociologist Irving Goffman described this in great detail in the 1950s. But what is different about this on social media? I go back to the description that I just read from Timothy Keller. He talked about three different aspects here. One is how incredibly tightly we can edit and carefully control and curate that identity, how much control we have over every single aspect. The second is the size and the scale and speed with which we can get this sort of feedback. We can literally quantify the likes immediately to gauge that feedback. And the third is the fact that this is so public. This sort of identity formation and self-presentation process doesn't happen with a handful of close friends. It happens in front of everybody. So I think when we take this very sort of natural identity formation and self-presentation process and we put it on steroids, and we supercharge it and we really foreground its role in shaping our identity, we have to start to ask, what happens to us when that's really kind of how we form our identity? Keller notes, and he's relying a lot on a lot of sociological work, that in generations past, the identity formation process involved, gauging sort of the expectations of us from the communities right around us. A lot of times that'd be family, neighbors, communities of faith, and then trying to meet those expectations, getting feedback about whether we've met those expectations, and then sort of adjusting based on that. But in our society, we've become a lot more mobile, we've become a lot more individualistic, and we've become a lot more disembedded from those kinds of communities, so that our identities are now a lot more fragile. They're not embedded in these deep kind of personal, close communities. And they're a lot more up for grabs in our sort of modern world. Again, this is not social media. This is social forces. So what's the upshot of this kind of this adjusted form of identity formation and this deep role that social media plays in filling the void for us in identity? Well, I think let's take it back to misinformation and the information problems on social media. I think a lot of times when we talk about the problem of information on social media, of misinformation, of bad partisan information, I think we tend to talk about these problems as if identity is downstream of information. as if the way that we consume information actually shapes the identity that we form, when the reality is like exactly the opposite. The identities that we form, the tribes that we think of ourselves in, they have a much deeper role in shaping how we consume information than the information that we get actually shapes that identity. So this is a primary thesis of the Duke sociologist Christopher Bale. He's done some really interesting research around this idea of echo chambers that we talked about earlier. And he's done experiments where, the common solution that we think of to social media echo chambers is like broaden your information diet. You need to like listen more to the other side. And so we did experiments where we said, okay, well, we're going to introduce a lot more of the other side to people's social media feeds, and we're going to make it like good information. Now, what would we think would happen when somebody does that in an experiment? We would think good things would happen. People would moderate their positions as they heard the other side and started to kind of realize, oh, maybe I'm wrong, and kind of move back toward the center. What do you think actually happened? The precise opposite of that. People who got exposed to more information from the other side actually got more extreme. They got more polarized. Now, if we're thinking about misinformation as an information problem, this makes no sense. But if we're thinking about information as fundamentally an identity problem, then that becomes a lot more clear. Because what it kind of shows, what this research shows, is that when we encounter differing opinions, we don't view that as just kind of a different information proposition. A set of rational propositions that is, oh, that's a slightly different conclusion than my own. What happens when we encounter differing information, I think potentially, especially online, is an attack on our very identity. It's an attack on who we are. And what happens when our identity is attacked? We retrench. We deepen that commitment to our identity. And really just our hatred of whoever has attacked it is really what results. So I think this is something that can be really jarring for us to think about, because we always think about ourselves as very like rational, logical consumers of information. I've never heard anybody who's just like, forget the facts. I just want opinions. And the more they affirm my pre-existing beliefs, the better. Nobody ever actually says this. What we all say is just like, no, I don't need opinions. I just need the facts. And I'm going to like coldly, and we think of ourselves as like, I'm going to coldly and rationally evaluate the facts and then come to this logical, rational decision. And we have decades of social science research that tells us that's not at all how we consume information. So this really explains why a lot of times we're coming at the misinformation problem the wrong way on social media. Because if you think about a lot of the solutions to misinformation, they're often put forward by platforms or the pundits or politicians. A lot of it is for politicians to regulate the platforms. The platforms respond by like banning people or deplatforming them or putting warning labels on particular types of information, or maybe we'll demonetize an account. And these might all be like decent ideas, but they all stem from a notion that misinformation is a supply side problem, that it is actually an information problem. When, as a media critic, Jack Schafer argues, it's not a supply side problem, it's a demand side problem. That's what's actually driving information. It's not as though if we just turned off or limited the spigot of misinformation, the problem would go away. No, the problem is this big sweeping tide of identity that so badly needs to be affirmed and validated and wants information to reaffirm that it doesn't even care whether that information is actually true. Now, again, I'm not trying to absolve Silicon Valley, ethically and morally. I think it has real ethical sort of culpability here in that it has knowingly amplified misinformation in that sort of relentless quest for engagement. But I think as soon as we start to think about all these sort of information problems and a lot of these sort of political polarization, echo chamber problems as more identity problems than information problems, we start to realize that a lot of these information-based solutions, which might be good solutions, they're just getting at the effects rather than the cause. They're cutting off the branch rather than tearing up the problem at the root. And the much harder, deeper problem to deal with is identity. And that's a lot harder to kind of realize, because that means the problem is in here, and it actually implicates all of us. So that's kind of where we're at. That's a pretty depressing place to leave it. So I do have some suggestions. And the interesting part about these suggestions, if the problem is not external, but rather internal, then the solution is not fundamentally going to be external either. So my solution is not like delete all your social media apps. And my solution is not like, oh, there's this one app that I downloaded that when you use it, you can limit your amount of app, or like you can feed this tree and make it grow, and you use social media less, and et cetera. All those things are good. Like I do things like that to limit my time on screens. But ultimately, that's not actually going to get at it unless we fix the deeper sort of issues that are at the root of these everyday sort of ethical problems. So as I'm kind of proposing some of these suggestions, I want to place this caveat that I am not doing this kind of from on high, as somebody who has reached sort of Zen-like peace with my social media feed. I'm doing this as a kind of fellow traveler, a fellow struggler, somebody who, when a foul gets called on my beloved Wisconsin Badgers basketball team, RIP, I immediately go to Twitter for validation that was not just a bad call, that was an atrocious call. It was the worst call. So that's kind of where I'm coming from here as somebody who struggles with this too. But I have five kind of suggestions, and if you're worried about how long I'm going to go, they get progressively shorter. So the first one, fortunately, the best thing that you can do, one of the best, I won't say the best, but one of the best things that you can do to solve this problem, fortunately, is something that many of you are doing right now, which is to get an outstanding liberal arts education. And this sounds like self-serving, and it kind of is a little bit, but I really mean it, and hopefully you WNL students have heard at some point in class, about the real meaning of liberal arts, that the liberal in liberal arts is really about kind of freeing the mind and the soul and the self to kind of be its best self and to pursue the good. And I think that freedom part is a really important part to latch onto. And when I think of freedom, I'm not thinking of the modernist, I can do whatever I want kind of freedom. I'm thinking about freedom more in the Augustinian sort of sense, in which Augustine kind of conceived of freedom as this sense that we were made to pursue the good and the right and the just and the true and the beautiful. And anything that hinders us from that pursuit actually makes us less free. So this is why I think that a sort of liberal arts education is really good, in that the freedom that it is kind of helping us reach towards is actually helping us to embrace our ethical obligations. Our obligations to do what is right and just, that this is actually what it means to be truly free in our minds and our hearts. So I want to talk about ethical obligations both to ourselves and to others. The ethical obligations to ourselves, I often think of the purpose of a liberal arts education as trying to create the kind of mind that you want to be at home in for the next 60, 70, 80 years. To create that kind of mind that is cozy and inviting, and also has different nooks and crannies that you can always explore and always be interested in, and that is the type of place that you want to spend time in and actually really keep improving. And that goes for a self and a soul. So our obligation to ourselves ethically is to continue to hone and create that kind of space in ourselves. And we have to ask ourselves, is our social media use on a daily basis helping us sort of create that mind, that soul, that self? And we think about our ethical obligations to others. Some are really obvious, like being civil and kind to others on social media, whether we're, talking under our own name or anonymously. I've seen you all on Yik Yak. And I think that's part of it, but I think we can also go deeper. And I think about, there's a philosopher of technology named Michael Sakasis who has posed 41 ethical questions of technology. And I think there are 3 particular questions that are really particularly useful in evaluating our ethical obligations to others with social media. He asks, upon what systems, technical or human, does my use of this technology depend? Are these systems just? And I think that's a really important question to ask as we're talking about that surveillance capitalism system that social media is built on, which is fundamentally exploitative and extractive. Second, he asks, does my use of this technology encourage me to view others as a means to an end? I think this is a really important question to ask ourselves as we put something out there on social media, and we are like waiting for literally the likes to tick up, as these small acts of kindness from our friends are simply a means to an end of our own validation and affirmation. Or as we're thinking about the kind of easy and superficial sort of forms of connection that social media can sometimes offer us, he has another question. Does my use of this technology make it easier to live as if I had no responsibilities toward my neighbor? Does it make it easier to live as if I had no responsibilities toward my neighbor? And a lot of times, social media makes us feel as if our responsibility toward our neighbor is like this big. Our responsibility is a like, or a comment that says, oh, that's hard, or I'll change my profile picture, or maybe a blue and white banner on my social media platform for a day. And that's the extent of my ethical responsibility to our neighbor. And it sort of blinds us to our greater and deeper ethical responsibility. But when we shift from social media kind of doing things to us to what are we doing with social media, it gives us a lot more kind of agency and power to kind of shape our own use of social media. We already know what they have optimized social media for. They optimized it for engagement, but we still have the agency to decide what we want to optimize social media for. And I think that's something really worth thinking about. Like, what would it look like for my social media feed or for your social media feed to be optimized around justice? Or to have a social media feed that is optimized, or a social media experience that is optimized around peace, or optimized around truth, or optimized around compassion or engagement, or not engagement, geez. Compassion is a different E word, compassion or empathy, not engagement, my goodness. Compassion or empathy or beauty. So these are the types of questions that we can start to think of ourselves when we embrace those ethical responsibilities from, that are rooted in us in a liberal arts education. Okay, second one. I told you they're going to get shorter. The second one, what is also really important, is our identity. When we think about, the obligations from the first point, that's probably going to require a broader and deeper information diet and social media diet. But we can't just say, oh, let's listen more to the other side, because we know from Bale's research that absent any sort of deeper identity change, that's not actually going to help us, and it might hurt us. So what we have to actually do is extricate and split up our identity from the information that we're consuming on social media and from how we are posting and who we are on social media. Going back to Tim Keller, he actually calls us to loosen the links between your ideas and your identity. Don't make your ideas into an identity such that any disagreement feels like an attack on your very being. That is a really high call. That is really difficult, to detach our ideas to our identity. Then the question is, well, what's left? This requires a really deeply rooted identity for all of us. And I think naturally, and where do we get that? I think naturally our society kind of says, well, this identity should come from kind of a strong sense of self-worth and self-confidence. But I don't think we can create that identity by ourselves. The philosopher Charles Taylor argues that all identity is inexorably and inevitably relational. And I agree with him. I don't think we can unilaterally create identity for ourselves. So what type of relationships create identity? And I would argue that that is relationships that are really deeply characterized by grace. Relationships where we can be radically honest and open and transparent with people, and we can be ourselves, warts and all, and be completely loved and completely known unconditionally. That is the root of a stable and healthy identity. Now, I'm a Christian, and those of you who are in the crowd who are people of faith might be going, I feel like maybe the type of relationship that might be is a relationship with God. And I would say yes. But all of us, any of us, people of faith, people of no faith, all of us can and need to move towards embodying that type of deep, radical openness, transparency, and grace in our relationships with others, because that's the only place that this kind of stable, rooted, healthy identity is going to come from, that displaces the searching for identity on social media. That brings me to the third point, which is grounding yourself in real, deep, and rich community. I think this is where these issues that we talk about on social media really should be worked out. So I don't see in my own social media feed, maybe some of you guys do, but I don't think I've ever seen a discussion of like a political or cultural issue in my social media feed where I'm like, that was the place to have that discussion. That was like really well done, the appropriate forum. And if you guys see that a lot, like, please let me know, because your friends are amazing at social media. No, we never actually see that, because it was always meant to be worked out, in these sort of deep and messy and whole relationships with people we actually know and live our lives with. That's the type of community that social media was always only meant to mimic or to augment. It was never meant to replace that kind of community. So you think about, you're always processing information on social media through a community. So who is the community that you're processing information through? Is it through some sort of disembodied, like, tribal horde that is like my people, the people who agree with me online? Or is it people who you are actually like living with and loving and being in these sort of grace-infused relationships, like warts and all? So I think, how does this kind of work in reality? Practically speaking, something as simple as like reading interesting books with interesting ideas and then discussing them with people with whom you are in community and in relationship with. The writer Alan Jacobs, he talks about, and I love this, he talks about finding people to think with who are not like-minded but like-hearted. And I love that idea. Not like-minded, but like-hearted. People who have that sort of openness of spirit, that generosity, that trust, and again, that sort of grace. And I think the more we embed ourselves in that kind of community, the more social media starts to kind of take on its proper place in our lives. Fourth, I would say to beware simplicity. I'm talking about simplicity of information and simplicity of narrative. All of you realize that the world is a complex place, and we have systems that are sort of designed to bend it into simplicity. So that means that when you encounter information on social media that makes you go, oh, I knew those people were like that. Of course it ended up that way. Or, yes, that's exactly why that idea is terrible. Or, of course, this person who did, this amazing thing is one of my people and part of my tribe. Like, that feeling is like candy for us, the dopamines. But instead, that should be a red flag for you, that things are too simple. They need to get more complicated. And that's also a sign for us that our identity has started to take over in how we're processing information. So we really need to beware of simplicity. And then the final thing, the fifth thing, I find a really good, kind of heuristic in getting at those deeper desires, what actually draws me and compels me to use social media. I love the journalist Catherine Price has a threefold kind of questions to ask yourself anytime you're picking up your phone or a social media app. And that is what for, why now, and what else? And what for is asking that question, like, what do I actually want here? Why am I doing this? Is it the need for affirmation, for information and control, or the need for easy connection that avoids the messiness and conflict of actual relationships? Why now? What am I trying to get away from? What might I be afraid of? And then what else? That kind of attunes us to the fact that there are always opportunity costs. There are always other things that we could be doing with our time, and actually better ways to pursue these goals that we might have, these purposes that are good and right and just. Now, we may go through that process and decide, actually, that social media is the right way to pursue this goal. It doesn't always have to lead to never social media. But I think it's really important to start asking those questions and getting at those deeper internal questions. And finally, I just tell you, please be skeptical, but don't let that skepticism curdle into cynicism. I, of course, want you to be skeptical. I'm a journalism professor. I've spent all this time talking about how information is not really that important compared to identity. And please, we still care about quality of information and read Hall. Ask any student who has taken my journalism 201 class and gotten the dreaded factor F. I still really care about accuracy of information. So I care about skepticism, but I see so many people who let that skepticism curdle into cynicism, this deep distrust of the motives of everyone around them. And I think that undermines and just poisons everything that I've just suggested, for you to do. All that kind of deep community and those ethical obligations to others and those relationships of grace and that like-heartedness, all of that is sort of poisoned by cynicism. So please be skeptical of the information that you see on social media, but most importantly, love and listen well, and please don't lose hope. Thank you.
Some folks have to move on, but we do have time for some questions, and we're going to use the mic to ask them of Professor Coddington. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll get you the mic.
Thank you for just coming and speaking to us tonight. I do have a question.
I came all the way from Reed Hall.
Yeah.
That's right.
As society prepares to enter this dawn of the new technical era, and what I mean is tech giants like Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, and the founding of this metaverse, this physical digital world. And I was interested if you have any thoughts or expectations as our physical human world prepares to transition or enter this physical digital world, if that makes sense.
No, that's a great question, and I wish I was more of a true philosopher of technology to be able to answer that in a robust way. But I do think we're already kind of we've been moving gradually in that direction as it is. So much of what I've been talking about is community that's sort of bound by physicality, and all these relationships and places that we get identity that are bound by physicality and defined by us actually being with each other, as opposed to things that are sort of ethereal and online and out there on social media. And this is the exact same dynamic, just pushing it into whole virtual worlds, and even that's not new. I don't know if any of the old people remember Second Life from 15 years ago, when that was supposed to be the future and the same sort of thing. So I don't want to go too hard into privileging the physical and just all physical is good and everything that is sort of virtual is evil, nothing good can happen there, because I just think that's way too easy and sharp of a dichotomy. But I do think that it is just, again, the systems just kind of bend and make it easier for us to kind of avoid that physical, sort of self, and the physical community and the people that that we're in, and these sort of physical arrangements that we're in. And I would like to push back against that. So I will not be entering the metaverse anytime soon. I don't think it's evil. I just why? So I don't know if that answers it, but I don't want to say oh man, we're just getting virtual and all that's going to be awful, terrible, but I just, I think that this is just another step along the process that people have been talking about for decades. Whether it comes to fruition in a real way, I don't know. A lot of money is being thrown at it. But I do think that a lot of the problems that I talked about with social media, they're persisting and becoming even more tempting in a metaverse kind of world.
Hi, thank you. In my CBSC classes, we talk about how there's like a positive correlation between screen time and depressive symptoms. And
Yes.
in most of those graphs, though, from 0 to 1 hours, there tends to be like a certain level of depressive symptoms, then it goes down towards 1 hour, and then it goes straight back up. And I was wondering if you thought there was like ideal amount of screen time or social media use.
Oh, no. Part of me wants to make Professor Murdoch answer this question. She knows a lot more about this than I do, being really attuned to that sort of research. I don't think it should be thought of in a sort of proper amount. I think the proper amount should be like, where's your heart, you know? And like, is this good for my soul, you know? And so for some people, that answer is just honestly going to be like 0. That's not the answer for me. But for other people, it's going to be, you know, something more than 0. I would say, were you asking about screen time or social media specifically? Both, yeah. I would say the answer is for most people between the ages of like 12 and, I don't know, 98 is like less than you have now, you know, like that's the real answer. But I don't think there's like if we just all do an hour and 17 minutes a day, then like society's problems will be solved, because I think different people are in, you know, like they're in different situations, and all of our souls are different, you know. So I would just say less. That's all I got.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for coming out. You mentioned that we should try to detach our ideas from our identity, and I'm kind of conflicted in how we can be able to achieve that. In the show Westworld, if you've seen it, I think
have not.
ideas are what gives people conscious and being able to be real. So if we do detach that, what would be the consequences, and how would that look like?
That's a good question. I think that naturally, I don't think any of us is ever going to be able to fully detach our ideas from our identity. Our ideas, the things, the products of our mind, and our kind of deeply held, whatever they are, political, social, cultural commitments, are so core to us that like we are never, going to be able to kind of fundamentally detach that from ourselves. But I do think that sort of practically speaking, I think that practically speaking, like for myself, it looks like not becoming, you know, so attached to whatever my particular sort of cultural positions are. Not that I don't care about them. My wife knows, she's heard the rants, she knows I care, but that those things fundamentally, if what I thought turned out to be wrong, my world's not broken. It's not broken, you know, because there's something there that is even beyond my thoughts on the Russia-Ukraine, you know, that conflict, or my thoughts on, you know, like political philosophy, that stuff can't even touch, you know, and that is the type of thing that I think is really deeply embedded in the kind of relationships that, you know, of family relationships of people who say, no matter where you go politically or culturally, I love you. I'm there for you, you know. And so it means that we're still like have a robust discussion of ideas, but at the end, in the end, it's not us that are attached to them, you know. We're able to kind of detach a little bit. Not that we're just playing intellectual games. We know that these things matter, but they are not us. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but that's kind of how I envision it.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Hey, Mark. I'm thinking about going back to sort of the age of television, sort of the 50s to the 80s, and comparing where we are now with social media and a technology that's much more interactive and also much more literate in a way, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of worry about the falling off of literacy and how that restrains violence.
Yeah.
I mean, a book culture. And in a way, we're returning to a new kind of literacy. It's just different. It's more liquid
Yeah.
somehow. So, but on the other hand, the age of television didn't manipulate us in the same way. That is, it was just entertainment. It didn't go into the soul like you're talking about. So can you make that comparison?
Yeah, yes and no. Yeah, you're talking about Neil Postman, and you should all read Amusing Ourselves to Death. Neil Postman, fantastic book. He was writing about, making this argument, with television back in the 1980s. He actually would say that television was not just entertaining us. It was actually most dangerous when it was turning every single other area of life into entertainment. That pure entertainment, like whatever would have been at the time for him, like Dallas, was not a problem. The problem was the evening news with Tom Brokaw sort of turned into Dallas and turned into entertainment. And to that extent, that hasn't changed. I think I can't even imagine what would happen if you showed Neil Postman TikTok. He's dead again. And so. But at the same time, you're right in that there is a little bit more of a kind of oral culture that is back, and a lot of scholars have talked about with social media. And I do think, as crude as the discourse is, there's actually discourse back. We couldn't talk back to our TVs, So there's the potential for something there, and the techno-utopians have always thought that potential was going to blow up and become awesome. But there's at least the potential there for that kind of literacy and that kind of actual discourse. We've poisoned it, But I do, to the extent that there's optimism there, I think about the fact that people are able to reach other people with ideas that are interesting and notable and important in ways that they simply could not have 30, 40 years ago. They can be read and heard. We can talk about podcasting and literacy. That's a whole other, discussion. But I do think there's something to that, even as some of the, kind of trends that television kind of started and were identified by Postman have only been accelerated with social media. So in some ways worse, and in some ways there are some glimmers, of hope for that return to kind of orality there.
All right, one more question. Anybody?
I try to be shy. It never works. Thanks, Mark. So I'm a skeptic. I think that the techno-utopians are wrong. I think your 5 points provide a way in which we might save ourselves. But if we look at the trend lines in society and the direction that sort of the technology companies are heading, and just sort of the history of what we've seen, extending it out, what do you see? Because it seems to me that the problems of social media will only become exacerbated and continue to accelerate.
Yeah.
And maybe the handful of us seeing enlightened presentations such as yours might be saved, but where does the rest of the world go?
I don't know. I mean, I was just thinking, dang it, Brian. I tried to end on a note of hope, and you were just like, but where do you actually see us heading? And it is, it's hard to summon, oh yes, I think things will turn around and actually become better. It's hard to answer that question in a sort of hopeful way. I do think that most people most people are not like the Joker in the Batman movies, chaos agents, trying to blow things up. And that gives me some sort of hope. But I also think that the natural sort of road that these things run in, the grooves that both our hearts and society already runs in, and that social media is basically happy to deepen, they're not leading in the right direction. They are leading in worse places. I don't really see how the polarization problem, at the very least, gets better. I don't really know, kind of where we go from here. It's really, but the difference is, like, I'm also, I don't doubt that it's possible that, some of these companies might actually do some good things. Like, it takes a ton of pressure. It takes a lot of pushing to, like, steer the company, the battleship in the right direction. But that's where I'm trying to avoid cynicism. And I think that there are more people who are realizing within those systems the damage that we are doing to ourselves with them, that I'm optimistic that something could change. So I'm trying to avoid getting into specifics because I have no clue. And the more I think about specifics, it's just kind of like, well, no, that wouldn't, Congress would be in charge of that. So, I don't know. But I don't want to just say, no, it's going to get worse and it's going to be terrible and then we'll all blow each other up at the end. Because I don't actually think that's how it's going to work. I think there are redemptive forces, like in the world. And I do think that the world is not lost in this front, even though things are getting worse. So I don't know what you do with that, but yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you for outlining a number of individual choices that we can make that do feel hopeful. And that has been the perfect way to end this series, which is all about individual choice. So thank you for leaving us with all of that good food for thought. And thanks for joining the series.
Thank you.